Hello, everyone. This is Matt Schlapp, and welcome to another episode of CPAC Live. We have a great show for you today, starting off with one of the most important voices in President Trump's cabinet, who is at the epicenter of this rethinking and fresh approach to our relationship with China and also the other economic powerhouses around the globe. He's someone you know well, but you might not have gotten to see him answer a lot of questions before, and we'd love to introduce him now. Ambassador Lighthizer, President Trump, through your office, has really reoriented and taken a fresh approach to how this country handles its trade policies. You've taken the lead on bilateral agreements with important key allies and economic actors around the globe. Why are these bilateral agreements the right way to go in most countries?
Let me first of all take a step back and just say one of the reasons, maybe one of the most important reasons the president ran for election was because of this imbalance in trade. And what that meant to him was the loss of jobs, ultimately the loss of communities, the loss of family. Opioids, all these horrible things that come from communities falling apart. And he saw that for years and years and years, and he saw it getting worse and worse to the point where our trade deficit had actually grown to over $800 billion a year. And we think about China, but it's with Europe, it's with an awful lot of people. And what moved him was he wanted jobs. His objective was not more efficiency, profit maximization for multinationals. His objective was helping working people and farmers. So that's what he did. So when you have that as your starting point, you have two ways you can go. One, you can go to the multilateral approach. We had tried that. And that probably helps multilateral corporations the most, but that was not his objective. So he said, let's go country by country. We're the biggest market in the world. We're by far the biggest economy in the world. And let's do deals that work for American farmers and workers.
So this question about these global institutions like the World Trade Organization, we've had this a lot of talk about the WHO. There's always been talk about the UN. They get marketed in this country as places where freedom abounds. Your experience specifically in the trade world is that actually Americans were getting a raw deal in a lot of these cases. And the president obviously feels that and was pretty direct about that.
No, for sure, that's true. Listen, there's a theory that if we just get rid of all the constraints, we'll have freedom. I would suggest a couple of things. Number one, you never get rid of all the constraints. The constraints. You have to be fighting to protect your people. That's number one. And number two, our objective is not, as I say, is not just to have the most efficient market around the world. Our objective is that most Americans live the way we want to live in a community. And if there's a certain amount of inefficiency in that, so be it. He starts from the idea of what kind of a community do you want, and he works backward to what kind of an economic policy do you want. And I really think that's a fundamental difference between him and other people. We still want market efficiency. We still believe that if we have a free market, a truly free market, the United States will do the best. Absolutely, for sure. But we're not Pollyanna anymore. We sit back, we look at these things, we see where people are weak in the market. Let me give you a great example. So we believe in Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and the notion is a competitive advantage. But the idea is that now you can buy a competitive advantage. Well, they never thought of that. They never thought of the notion that you can create scale through protectionism and then take advantage of another country. And we've seen that sort of thing happen in the United States for too long. So the president has really turned it around. I think the deals he's done, Mexico, Canada, Japan, China, South Korea, and then a lot of other smaller deals for various products in various places. I think we've seen a real change in the approach. I've always believed that if you're the biggest player, you're better off doing things bilaterally. I think the president is completely right about that.
Well, you mentioned this word change, and you mentioned Adam Smith, the Scottish Enlightenment, the idea of free markets. which I think we all agree with. So if you have a reciprocal relationship where both parties are roughly treating each other equally, that's the goal, right? But it did seem like with China that they were playing America for suckers for too long. Do you think the communist government in China realizes how different the American approach is now?
Oh, I think they realize that President Trump is focusing on this. He realized how important it is, and he's going to do what's right for American workers. And by the way, he said it many, many times. He expects China to do what's right by their workers, and that competition, that tension, is what's going to decide what happens. But he has changed that relationship. It was very, very imbalanced. It's still imbalanced, but I think it's moving in our direction. We have a complicated relationship with China. But in this sphere, in this economic sphere, we're now starting to write rules that'll work for both of us. And hopefully that's what will pan out over time.
You penned an op-ed for the New York Times a week or so ago where you talked about how America shed 5 million manufacturing jobs as a function of misguided globalist policies. And you talked specifically about the shedding, I think you can correct me on the numbers, of 2 million American jobs when China was entered into the World Trade Organization. You also pointed that there were a lot of consultants that flew around the world trying to convince multilateral corporations to offshore their manufacturing to countries like China. You know, Fox News and others have talked about McKinsey actually representing American corporations and giving this kind of advice. Is it really 5 million jobs that we shed as a result of these policies?
Well, I think it's at least that number. I'm not an economist, right? But I have studied this a lot, and most of the economists would agree with that number. You can see a substantial fall off literally from the time we entered into the original NAFTA in the mid-1990s. It got worse in 2000 when China joined the WTO, and it continued until recently. Now the president, before this current crisis, the president had brought back 600,000 manufacturing jobs. These are jobs that Obama and all the smart people said were never coming back. And these are the kind of jobs we have to have in this country. We got to remind ourselves, 50% of our citizens and working citizens don't have a college degree. They have a high school degree. Those people have to be in the middle class, right? If we're going to have the kind of community that you and I grew up in and want our kids to grow up in. And that's what the president believes. The other point I was making is what has happened is you saw a lot of people, a lot of business people going around the world making changes at the suggestion of McKinsey and others. I always jokingly refer to them as 28-year-old kids with a memo that they have written and sold 9 different times. Right. They go there, they're trying to make another dime. It helps them in the short term. It helps them for the next quarter. It might help them within the period of that CEO's contract. But the bottom line is it hurt this country an awful lot, and the president wasn't going to stand for it. And my position is, in the long run, it was not in the interest of those countries either. Of those companies either. Those companies were better off with supply chains closer. They're better off making the product in the United States, particularly where this is the market. So we really have changed things.
So with the onset of this terrible virus, Corona, it's an example of the fact that, when you're dealing with a communist country like China, you don't always have the same types of transparency, or hardly ever have the same types of transparency you have in a country like America. And it can be quite dangerous when you don't have the same type of rule of law, which makes it hard to have a bilateral agreement on things. Is that a challenge?
Well, I think it's a challenge. I mean, there are a couple of ways to think about it. One, there are transparency issues. There are constraints about passing information around in that kind of a government, in that governmental system. But I think the problem with these long supply chains is not just a Chinese problem. It's a problem that goes beyond that. Running your supply chains through Vietnam or other places means that you're going to have other priorities when you need the product. And the profit at the end of the day was very, 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 very little. Sometimes people were even doing things to avoid environmental and labor rules. I mean, there were a whole lot of things going on here. But the biggest part of the problem was China, for sure, but it was way, way beyond China. And it's just something that somebody had to get a hold of before it was too late. Fortunately, this president did it. The unfortunate truth is we need another 4 years if we're actually going to sit down there and complete this policy. And hopefully we're going to get those 4 years, because this has been a directional change. These things take time. But I keep coming back to changing the focus of economic, but for me, trade policy, from one of profit maximization for multinational companies to focusing instead on workers and farmers and what's good for our communities. That's a very significant change. To me, it's the heart of conservatism. It's the heart of conservatism that you're trying to protect, you're trying to conserve what's good in the American way of life. And if we do that, the rest of this stuff will flow from it.
And it's also the idea that the individual is respected. What I keep hearing in your language and what I hear about in the president's language is that we have to check our math on the idea of a global trade regime and see if it's actually helping everyday Americans. Yes, they want to pay lower prices for their consumer goods, but they need to have a job. And their societies need to have a tax base where you can have vibrant schools and little league teams and all the rest. I mean, you got to go back and see how it's working for the middle class, right?
See, I think that's the essence of it. It's the dignity of work. The fact is that Americans, and most people, but Americans are the ones I focus on, are happier when they have a job, a good job, one that pays a fair wage, and where they're constructing something, where they're doing something. That's what makes communities. That's what makes families stay together. That's what makes our kids proud of their parents. This is the sort of thing that we've kind of lost sight of when we focused blindly on efficiency for companies, many of which don't even consider themselves American. So I think there was two ways to go. There's a certain group of people who think like us, who just said, oh no, get rid of all the constraints. Whatever happens, happens. Free markets, cheap t-shirts. And then there's another group that said, we want efficiency for sure, and we want to clear away the restraints on trade. But our focus should be on the community and the individual and on the family. That's what makes this a great country, and that's more important. You go around and talk to working class people and say, would you pay a little bit extra for your consumer goods to live in a better community? And almost all of them say absolutely they would. When you go to the Harvard economics faculty, maybe you get a different answer, right? But the kind of people that we worry about.
Invite me there, Ambassador. I've never been invited there. I'm hoping that invitation is coming.
I think we probably have that in common, Matt. I don't think I'm going to be invited either. If I do, I'll take you along as a bodyguard.
But what you brought up in the New York Times, I actually would be very good at that. What you brought up in the, I have been on the streets of Hong Kong. What you brought up in your New York Times editorial, which I think is important to know, and what I've had relayed to me with people in our CPAC community who are free market devotees, Adam Smith devotees, which is the idea of if you offshore the job into a country that basically has very minimal standards of labor, environment, et cetera, maybe even treat their workers terribly, they don't have basic human rights, and they can make consumer products there and send them back to America, basically tariff-free or with low tariffs. We're setting up a situation where communities in America will, of course, shed more jobs because that's a bargain that's hard for a multinational to pass up.
No, that's correct, particularly if the CEO is paid based on his stock price in 3 months. No, for sure that's true. You will see people going out, going places to arbitrage environmental standards, labor standards. I mean, that's why there always has to be a constraint on this notion of chasing the market at any cost. And the other point I wanted to make is there's an example that's been written about. Let's say right now, to get away from China for a second, Korea has a very competitive steel industry. Now, why is that? It has nothing to do with any natural advantage in Korea. It's because a government has subsidized and created over time a very competitive steel industry. Well, we can't be in a position where we say, okay, fine, whoever creates the most effective, the most efficient industry can take over our industry if they do it through government subsidies, if they do it through no environmental standards, if they do it through forced labor or what we consider to be non-minimum standards on labor. So there has to be, kind of a thought process in here. Clearly, we don't want to go too far one way. We don't want to go too far the other way. But my sense is, and I believe it's the president's sense, is if you're focusing on the right objective, and that objective is these American working people, then you're going to end up with the right answer most of the time.
And what I heard there is reciprocity, which is tariff is a big term. It's basically not just a tariff, it's a barrier, which is a big term that incorporates a lot of different things. And if a country like Korea is using all of these perverse tactics to try to make their product seem freer or more efficient, when actually all they're doing is creating an unfair environment, then you no longer have reciprocity. It's like they got the rules that benefit them, and America has the rules that doesn't benefit them.
Well, I think that's right. And it's kind of a race to the bottom. And one of the points I want to make is you have to go back and say, why do these people have this advantage? And is it a true, David Ricardo, competitive advantage? I would suggest that child labor, most people would agree, that's not a competitive advantage. Slave labor isn't one. I would suggest not having minimum environmental standards. That's not a legitimate competitive advantage. Government subsidies, that's not a legitimate competitive advantage. So it's a complicated issue. The important thing for us is to keep our eye on the ball, to keep our eye on what our objectives are, and then to take on one country after another. I think that's what the president is doing.
Let me ask you, as we let you get back to your incredibly busy day, I want you to give us a little insight into President Trump. I've seen you over there in the halls of the White House outside the Oval Office late at night. The president is mostly mischaracterized by the news media as kind of being a 9-to-5er at best, which is completely at odds to the truth. How do you see him? How do you interact with him? And how does he make decisions?
Well, I say, first of all, I see him a lot. I'm the most biased person you're going to have on. I love him. He's the kind of person that if you care about basic stuff like we do, he's the kind of guy that the more you're with him, the more you like him. He works literally all the time. I've had calls at 10:30 at night, literally where the operator will say, I'm in bed, right? The operator will say, take a second, Ambassador Lighthizer, get yourself collected. The president's on the phone. I've had calls early in the morning. He never turns off. I've seen him tired a couple of times, but usually that was, on an airplane flying between Asian capitals, right? Where who knows how many hours. He's a very, very focused, very hardworking guy. He never, at least with me in my area, talks about politics or how it relates to politics. He's talking about his objective, which is how it affects farmers, ranchers, working people. So it's a great experience. It's a great honor for me to be with him. To me, he's charming and he's funny. He's very, very tough, very, very focused. Just a good person to be around. And I say to my staff when I come back a lot, it's too bad more people don't have that exposure, right? Too bad more people can't sit there and say, I spent time with this guy and see that he laughs and he gets the joke. He gets the joke, Matt, in a way that, and I've known some of his predecessors really didn't, right? He kind of understands that we're doing something extraordinary under extraordinary circumstances in a way that other people don't. So I'm a huge fan, and I do wish there was a way to spend more time that people could just see him. In terms of how he makes decisions, I'll tell you, it's a very interesting process. Now, remember, in my area, he knows the stuff, right? He's been doing it for 30 years. He had these ideas in the 70s, very similar ideas.
He's been saying the same things for 30 years.
That's precisely right. That's precisely right. And what he does is he knows the stuff, he knows the basic facts, and he gets 3 or 4 people in front of him who disagree. And he says, okay, fine. He says this, what do you say? He says that. It's a very, very interesting process. And then he makes a decision based on all the facts that he gets. So he hears all sides of the issue. These are very controversial issues. Then he thinks about it. He makes a decision. It's a very impressive decision-making process, different than a lot of other people with whom I have worked. It's very deliberative, but it's very sort of oral, and let's argue. And he argues with you, and you argue with him, and we argue with each other. And then he says, "Okay, here's where we are," and he makes the decision. It's interesting to watch.
Yeah, I would agree. You've got a much better insight than probably anybody into how it works, and from my standpoint, it's working pretty well. Ambassador Lighthizer, we've been doing CPACs for over 50 years. We want you to come join us. We went overseas and had 5 CPACs overseas in important countries like Japan and Brazil and Australia. There's a lot of talk about punching out into India and UK and other places in Europe and Asia. And the good news is when we go overseas, there's tremendous goodwill for America and tremendous goodwill for the president. So even though you're reapproaching this global approach to trade, in a lot of capitals that we travel to, they're rooting for us.
Well, look, people know that the United States is really the last great hope for the world. There's just no question about that. I completely agree with it. People disagree on style, they disagree on this and that, but I think most places you go in the world, they realize that we're the ultimate force for good, that we're going to stick up for ourselves, but together we'll make the world better.
Well, those are great words to give a charge to us for this most important day as we were fighting Chinese corona, and many of us sitting in our houses who are anxious to get back into the economy. We're going to now show you a video clip of the president being interviewed by the great Maria Bartiromo, in which he talks about more about this virus. And Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to be right back with you right after this video clip.
China, I made a great trade deal. The ink wasn't dry when the plague came over from China, but the ink wasn't even dry.
They didn't tell you about it when they came here on the 15th of January and shook everybody's hands.
That was never even a subject. That was not anything that anybody really understood or knew about at the time. But China, I'm very disappointed in China. I will tell you that right now.
Well, that was a great video clip of the president talking about dealing with this new approach to the communist government in China. And as we all deal with the onslaught of Chinese corona, and there's absolutely a part of it that is a terrible international tragedy and American tragedy, but there's this other piece of it, which is conservatives trying to figure out how they make decisions in their own lives and for their own families, so that as we do every day when we leave the house and get in our car or whatever we get into to get to work, the balancing the risks you take in life with your desire to lead a big, full American life and accomplish on this earth what God put you on the earth to do. And I'm really honored to have with us now a friend of mine, Dr. Brooke Miller, who has a medical practice in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And also, he's a multitasker, much like myself. He is the president of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. You can see that little insignia on his lapel. That is not a donkey, okay? That's for sure not a donkey. And
no, absolutely not.
Dr. Miller, it's our honor to have you on CPAC Live. As you've been treating patients, and I know you'll keep confidences as far as that's concerned, but as you're treating patients and seeing people affected by this virus, what do Americans need to learn from your insight as a medical doctor?
I think as we go along, we learn more and more about this virus and how it's affecting and who it's affecting. It is a global pandemic, and it's created quite a bit of panic worldwide. And we have some people that absolutely will not go out in public, and some people that are going about their daily lives. And I think as we learn more and more about treatment of the virus, transmission of the virus, we're going to have to get back and open up and do our normal daily routine, just using some common sense. One of the biggest things that I've seen, or that we have seen in primary care, is how this virus is affecting people from a psychological standpoint. It's causing a great deal of anxiety and depression and panic. And that's one of the things that we see a lot with this virus.
So what you're saying is there's secondary consequences, as most people will not get this virus. Most people who get this virus, their health will not be substantially harmed over time. They'll survive. But because the news media and everyone has us so panic-filled about the fact that our loved ones could die from this, and it's true that they could, especially if they're in vulnerable categories.
Yeah.
That worry and stress is making America sick.
Absolutely. People are staying inside. They're not getting out. We know things that help the immune system, help our mental health system, are things, simple things. Exercise, getting out in sunlight, doing our daily routines. When we disrupt our daily routines, it really affects us and causes the stress hormones to go up in our body and makes us more susceptible to disease and other illnesses.
I mean, I think God created human beings to be social. And I think when you tell people that having social interaction is going to kill you, that could make you very, very, very depressed.
Absolutely. You're so right there. And I think the important thing that we need to do is moving forward is that we need to have people that are at lower risk go about their daily lives, start working, start doing their interactions, and people that are at high risk, then those are the ones that we need to protect and try to shelter and try to prevent from getting the virus. But you're exactly right. We need to. I'm of the feeling that we need to get back to our lives in a sensible manner.
I agree with you, Dr. Miller, and that's what I aim to do as well, with probably taking some precautions, some things my mother and grandmother taught me as a young boy. Wash your hands with hot soapy water as many times as you can throughout the day. Don't be touching your face all the time. I remember my mom telling me, she grew up in New York, and I remember being in the subway, and she said, don't touch anything. And when you're a kid, you touch everything. These are some of the basic lessons that can take us a long way to avoiding risk.
Yeah, we know, we've been taught my entire medical career that viruses are spread from from mouth to surface to your hand. You touch your mouth, touch your nose, touch a surface. Someone comes along and touches that surface with their hand, touches their face. So hand washing is a big important thing as far as prevention of spread of disease and virus. It's interesting that we talk about spread of disease. First off, the quote experts came up, said, "Oh, we should not wear masks." We don't know what the reasoning was for them not wearing masks, and then all of a sudden they changed courses and said, "No, everybody should wear a mask. It reduces your risk of contracting the virus." But now we're seeing studies come out where they did a study on medical students and who wore masks, and the medical students that wore the mask touched their face an inordinate amount of time. So common sense would tell you that actually wearing a mask, if you have a tendency to touch your face, may increase your risk of contracting coronavirus.
Well, you said experts. I think this is one of the big problems, Brooke, people are having, which is where can someone go to really get the medical facts? It seems like there's a political hype to those that want to keep us shut down and a political hype to people who want to get us opened up. Where do you go just to get the information, or do we have to suspend that for this period of time because it's hard to find where the facts are?
I think your family doctor is probably your best source of legitimate, conscientious, well thought out procedures and things to do to try to prevent the virus. I don't want to be giving out medical advice here, but I tell my patients, I want them to supplement with vitamin D. I want them to exercise. I want them to get 8 hours of rest every night. There's evidence to suggest that melatonin now is helpful in prevention of the viral infection. We do know that children are not as susceptible as elderly people. Age is a big risk factor, and we know that melatonin levels drop dramatically as we age. So there's a lot of thought process about supplementing with melatonin, which is a very safe compound or hormone that's secreted by the pineal gland in the brain.
So what you're basically saying, common sense things. I stopped smoking cigars just because I read so much about the impact on lungs. I probably shouldn't be smoking too many cigars anyway. Try to lose a little bit of weight. I think a lot of us are trying to get around and walk around the block. So it's kind of these common sense steps. Part of that common sense, which I think we need to go back to, is this idea: if kids are maybe even the lowest risk pool in society, these kids, and I've got 5 of them, who aren't in school, they are really suffering with the lack of social interaction. Their studies are just being, are deteriorating. We can all kid ourselves that it's just like going to school, but it is not, even for these schools that are doing a good job. Do you think there's hope in the Commonwealth of Virginia and around the country that will get the kids back to school, since they are not really in a high-risk group?
Well, you would think common sense would dictate that, but I guess that's all up to the governor. Kids
I don't
are
know if we should talk. I don't know if we should talk about our governor in the Commonwealth. He's so busy keeping us all comfortable that we're not too comfortable.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge impact on kids. The social distancing is a huge impact on the kids, and they are the lowest risk. And this is just my personal opinion, but I feel in order to defeat this virus, we're going to need to develop a so-called herd immunity, where the healthy people contract the virus, have very little complications or side effects from them, and therefore are not spreading it throughout the community in the future when we do open things up. So I think opening up society with healthy, low-risk people is probably the most sensible thing to do at this point in time.
Our executive director, Dan Schneider, is from Kansas. I'm from Kansas. When I hear a cattleman talk about herd immunity, I'm hearing the lessons I heard when I was a younger person, that sometimes, farming, nature gives us important lessons in life. And what you're alluding to is this idea that even if you hole yourself up in your basement, lock all the doors, order everything on Amazon or Walmart.com or whatever, your place of choice is, don't touch the package for 72 hours as it sits on your front porch. It might very well get stolen, but anyway, as it sits on your front porch, if you take every precaution in the world, and we tried to as a country take every precaution, the percentage chance you're going to have some interaction with the virus, it's inevitable.
Absolutely. And we're actually hindering our immune system by continuing to not interact, not go out, not get sunlight, not get exercise, not get social interaction. Our stress hormone levels go through the roof when we alter our daily routine and things like that. And that just lowers our immune system and makes us more susceptible to not only coronaviruses, but other diseases and illnesses.
All right. So Dr. Brooke Miller, you raise cattle. I've just heard in there an invitation that I'm to bring my family down to your ranch, and maybe we'll eat some ribeyes together, build up our immune system, and we'll go hang out in the sun.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me tell you something. Despite what you've heard for the last 30 years, it's now, without a doubt, red meat is the superfood on the planet, and it is the healthiest thing that you can eat.
Oh my gosh. I tell you, every Kansas part of me is tingling right now, because I can't agree with you more. And I'm never happier than after I have a big, juicy, rare steak. I want you to know, Brooke. So we're going to come down and see you. Dr. Brooke Miller, president of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. Thanks for being with us on CPAC Live. What a great show it was today. We're going to be back with you Friday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Twitter, Facebook, go to conservative.org. Join us. Thanks for being with us. This is Matt Schlapp saying, take it easy, be safe, and go back to work.